The Lord be with you. Please stand for the gospel reading. So for the gospel this morning, I've stitched together a whole bunch of musings from various wisdom sources, some from the Jewish tradition, some from the Buddhist tradition, some from Christian tradition. I've just stitched them together because they highlight what I want to talk about in the homily this morning. So it's trying to describe God in numbers. So here's how it goes. From the Hebrew tradition, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. He is our Lord. From Buddhism, form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. And from the Judeo-Christian scriptures, from the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus said, for human beings this is impossible, but for God all things are possible. And from Isaiah, do you not know, or have you not heard, that the Lord is an eternal God? From Psalm 139, where can I go from your spirit? From your presence, where can I flee? And from Psalm 147, great is our Lord and mighty in power. To his wisdom there is no limit. From the book of Revelation, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the one who is, and who was, and who is to come. From the Buddhist tradition, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. And from a Christian mystic called Meister Eckhart, I pray daily to God to rid me of God. Words inspired by God. For me personally, one of the most mystical phenomena on our planet is mathematics. Very, very strange. Numbers are very, very strange commodities. They're mystical commodities. We manipulate them regularly on a day-to-day basis, and we have very little realization and understanding of just how mystical they are. You take even the simplest form of mathematics, simplest numbers of all, positive integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we think these are really, really simple. We can manipulate them very, very easily to kind of get change and buy groceries and whatever, but it's very, very complicated. So you would imagine, for instance, that the positive integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you can keep counting. And then you add them together, you're always going to get another positive integer. So you add 1 to 2 and you get 3. 1 plus 2 plus 3 is equal to 6. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 is equal to 10. Next one is 15, 21, 28, etc. So we imagine that if you just keep adding positive integers together, you can be sure of three things. You're going to get a bigger and bigger number. It's going to be an integer, and it's going to be positive. No matter how far along you go, if you keep adding integers to each other, you can expect that you're going to get a very big number. It's going to be a whole number, an integer, and it's going to be positive. Well, it doesn't work out like that.
What's an integer?
An integer, a whole number, like a 1 or a 2 or 3, is distinct from a fraction. Okay. Yeah? So a whole number like 2 or 17 or 39 or whatever. And you think that if you keep adding integers together, all the ways to infinity, you're going to get bigger and bigger integers. And they're always going to be positive, and they're always going to be whole numbers. Not so. If you add all the integers to infinity, you get a number which is not big, it's not an integer, and it's not even positive. Here's the mystery. If you keep adding the integers to infinity, the number you wind up with is minus 1 over 12. Totally counterintuitive. If you stop anywhere before infinity, you get a positive integer, it's very, very big, and it's a whole number. But if you keep going to infinity, and you keep adding the positive integers to infinity, you wind up with minus 1 over 12. And this is actually a very important number in quantum mechanics. If you want to check it out, there's a very interesting little YouTube video. It's only about 7 minutes long. If you go onto it and check it out, when you sum the positive integers to infinity, it's a very simple little illustration of the fact that you wind up with minus 1 over 12. So numbers are mysterious. They're mystical. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to just basically make two main points today. I'm going to talk about the mysticism of mathematics, and secondly, I'm going to talk about the mathematics of the mystery of God. So basically just 2 little points this morning. So I'm totally convinced as a mathematician that numbers are mysterious. They're literally a gift from God for us. And we manipulate them and we think we understand what they are. And they have a long, very, very long, interesting history. Some of the greatest mathematicians throughout human history have also been deeply mystical people. And you find it in Hinduism. They made tremendous contributions to number theory. You find it in the medieval Muslim mathematicians. You find it in Egypt. You find it among the Sumerians. You find it in the Greeks. And you find it in Europe, particularly in the 16th and 17th and 18th century, that many of the great mathematicians were deeply mystical people. But initially we think that, okay, numbers are about the positive integers. We can all manipulate 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s and 5. But actually, the invention of the negative integers, -1 or -17, that's a huge leap of faith. So that was a huge movement in mathematics to start devising, either inventing or discovering, that there could be actually negative numbers, -37. And then we moved on to the notion, either we discovered or we invented the concept of zero. And this is a deeply, deeply mystical understanding as well, the invention of zero. It's hugely important. And then at some stage, we went on and we invented the concept of infinity, that which is boundless. That's a hugely mystical shift as well. And in between all of that stuff, we developed what were called the rational numbers. And rational numbers is not like they're reasonable, that they think logically. It's that they can be expressed as a ratio, like A over B, or 6 over 17, or whatever. And then we invented the irrational numbers. And we think that the irrational numbers are just numbers that are having a bad day. The irrational numbers just simply means numbers that can't be expressed as a ratio, as A over B. And then we invented what were called the prime numbers, or discovered them. And these are numbers that can only be divided by themselves, and 1, like the number 7, or the number 17, or the number 31. You can only divide them by themselves and by 1. And then we invented what we called the real numbers. And then finally we invented what were called the imaginary numbers. Now these aren't just kind of whimsical. These have extraordinary pragmatic application. So just give you some examples. When people invented the notion of negative numbers, negative integers, this was an extraordinary leap forward. So if I said to Tom, you have -$3, what does that mean? How can you have -$3? There is no such thing as a negative amount in the physical world. It only exists in the symbolic world. So what it means is Tom owes me $3. So he can't actually -$3, but he owes me 3, and we represent that as a negative number called -3. So negative numbers do not exist in the physical world. They exist only in the symbolic world. Similarly, 0 does not exist in the physical world. If I say to you, I have 0 apples in my backpack, 0 means it does not exist. So how can I have that which does not exist? How can I claim to have in my backpack that which does not exist? 0 means it does not exist. So 0 again, it does not exist in the physical world. It can only exist in the metaphysical or the symbolic world. And then you get to the notion of infinity, and now you're in big trouble. Because in mathematics, mathematicians claim that there are 2 kinds of infinity. So not all infinities are equal. So there's what they call countable infinity. So the integers, you say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You can keep counting all the way up to infinity, but you can keep counting. So they're countable. And then there's a bunch that were called uncountable infinity. So you take any 2 rational numbers, like no matter how close they are, let's say 1 over 187 and 1 over 188, they're very, very close. There's an infinite number of other rational numbers in between those 2. You can keep breaking it up and slicing it. So they call that uncountable infinity. You can't count it. So not all infinities are equal. And then the pièce de résistance, mathematicians claim that you can take any number, no matter how big it is, and if you multiply it by 0, the result is 0. So you can take 45,003,706 and 402 and multiply by 0, and you get 0. Mathematicians claim that you can take any number, no matter how small it is, and if you multiply it by infinity, you get infinity. So what happens when you multiply 0 by infinity? Do you end up with 0, or do you end up with infinity? Because if you multiply any number by 0, you get 0. If you multiply any number by infinity, you get infinity. So what happens when you multiply 0 by infinity? So you've got a conundrum. So mathematics is filled with these extraordinary mysteries. So we're digging deeper and deeper and deeper. So with that understanding, I want to go on to my second point, which is the mathematics of the mystery of God. Because I'm convinced God is a mathematician. Now, of all the numbers, that we've contended with, maybe the most extraordinary of all are what are called the imaginary numbers. So some few hundred years ago, an Italian mathematician says, I'm going to invent a number. Now, according to mathematics, any number you take, and if you multiply it by itself, you have to get a positive outcome. So if you take 6 and multiply it by 6, you get plus 36. But even if you take minus 6 and multiply it by itself, you get plus 36 again. So any number multiplied by itself has to give a positive result. Now, this mathematician in Italy, hundreds of years ago, says, well, I'm going to invent a number such that when you multiply it by itself, it gives a negative result. And said, this is ridiculous, it can't exist, there's no such thing possible. And he said, well, I'm going to call it I for iota, and I'm going to define it as the square root of minus 1. So if you multiply the square root of minus 1 by the square root of minus 1, you get minus 1. So here's a number such that when you multiply it by itself, you get a negative outcome. Now, this wasn't just Michigas. All of space trajectory, all of our space technology, our interorbital flights are depending upon the notion of imaginary numbers in 3 dimensions, I, j, and k. So it has an extraordinary pragmatic application. All of interstellar travel is based on the notion of imaginary numbers. So you can make something up, you can imagine something, and it has extraordinary pragmatic outcomes. The same thing is true. I lived on the equator for 14 years in East Africa, between 1972 and 1986. Literally, I lived on the equator, crossed it several times every day. And I can guarantee you, there is no bump on the planet when you cross the equator. You don't kind of jump off in your car. It's a totally imaginary concept, but it has extraordinary pragmatic application. The idea of an equator allows us to map a grid system on planet Earth that allows us to use our GPS system so we can locate very precisely where you are on the planet in any place you are. An imaginary thing called the equator. So what happens then when you start imagining God? So first I have to redefine what I mean by imagination. I've said this to you a few times before. We think that imagination is the ability to make up stuff which is not real. And that's not imagination, that's fantasy. That's not imagination. Imagination is the ability to shift my state of consciousness, to enter into different dimensions, to interact with energies and entities that reside in those other dimensions, to learn from them, and to bring back into this waking state of consciousness what I've learned in the other place. That's what I mean by imagination. And for me then, reality is multi-tiered. It exists in many, 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 many dimensions. So anything that could be thought of is real. Anything that can be dreamt about is real. Anything that can be sensed is real. Anything that can be, encountered is real. So there is nothing except reality. Our experience puts us in touch with reality. But there are different dimensions and different frequencies to the reality. And then truth then comes from that realization. For me, truth and fact are very different. Something can be factual, but not true. And something can be truthful, but not factual. Facts have to do just with the physical world. Truth has to do with the metaphysical reality. So for me, something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God. So when I understand then what I mean by imagination, and by truth and by reality, now we can start talking about God and the mathematics of the mystery of God. So what happens then when you imagine God, in the sense in which I'm defining imagination? So imagination is not to make up an entity which isn't real, but rather to have the ability to transform your consciousness, enter into other dimensions, and interact with the energies and the entities that reside there, learn from them, and bring them back into this waking state of consciousness. So what happens then when we enter these realms and we encounter the divine? Now, the trick is, of course, is that not all dimensions are equal, and not all dimensions are light-filled. So we have to be really, really careful when we travel interdimensionally, whether you're doing that through meditation, or you're doing it through hypnosis, or people who do it through entheogens, or whatever route you choose to take. If you change your state of consciousness, you have to go very, very guardedly and very, very carefully, because not all dimensions are equal. So if you go into dark dimensions and you encounter the divine, you're going to come back with a notion of God, which is going to talk about hells and punishments and a distant, demanding divinity. If you enter into dimensions which are light-filled, you're going to come back with a very, very different notion of God, a God of love and a God of compassion. So our imagined notions of God have to do where we safari, where we move in our interdimensional travels. That's very, very important for us. Now, when you enter these realms, there are some very special numbers attached, and that's the mathematics of the mystery of God, as far as I'm concerned. And there'll be three great numbers that you will encounter in all the great wisdom traditions, three great numbers. It will be 0, 1, and infinity, which is why I chose these readings this morning. So let's start off with the notion of infinity. If you imagine, in the sense in which I'm defining imagine, if you imagine a divinity which is infinite in some senses, very often human beings started off with the notion of a plurality of gods. And in ancient times, there were in three kinds of categories. You had what I would describe as regional divinities, and then you had tribal divinities, and then you had portfolio divinities. So the regional divinities were the notion that there were particular gods, associated with particular geographical locations. And if you move into a particular area, you have to pay obedience to those gods. And the Romans particularly, when they conquered an area, they were very, very careful to always honor the local divinities, and to insist that the local inhabitants whom they had just conquered continued to worship their own gods, because the Romans did not want to upset these regional divinities. So that was one group of divinities that were associated with particular geographical locations. The second bunch of divinities were, I would describe them as tribal divinities. They chose a particular nation, and they were like nomadic gods. They wandered around with them. So, for instance, the Hebrews had, a mobile or a nomadic divinity called Yahweh, and he wandered wherever they wandered. He wandered with them. So there were people who believed that their gods moved with them as they moved. And then there was a third category of gods that I would classify as portfolio gods. There were gods who specialized in particular kinds of activities. So if you were interested in lovemaking, there was a particular god, that you wanted to worship. If you were interested in agriculture, there were other gods who specialized in agriculture. If you were into warfare, there were particular gods who specialized in warfare. So you had to choose your divinities dependent upon what activity you were hoping to engage in. So that was God kind of regarded as infinite, that there was a pluriformity of divinities. And we ascribed then all kinds of great powers to them. They were omnipresent, or they were omniscient, or they were omnipotent, or they were eternal. We ascribed these infinite classifications to them. So that's what happens when you fix the notion of infinity to the divine. At some stage, it began to shrink down, and the number 1 became very, very important. But it went through a few stages. So the Zoroastrian religion, the great religion of Persia, shrank all of the gods down to 2 gods. A god called Ahura Mazda, who was the god of light, and a god called Ahriman, who was the god of darkness. So they were the very, very first to try to shrink the entire pantheon down to manageable proportions, that of light and dark, and they constantly contended with each other. And they had a huge influence on Judaism, because the last 2 tribes of Israel were taken into exile in the year 589 BC by the great Babylonian Empire, and they spent 70 years in exile in Babylon. And during that period, the Persians overcame and conquered Babylon, and they brought in the great religion of Zoroastrianism. And this had a huge effect on Judaism. So when the Jews went back into the land of Israel, they took a lot of the Zoroastrian thinking with them, and Christianity, which was birthed by Judaism, also incorporated these notions. So now you've shrunk the notion of the many, many, many divinities down to 2. Now, in Judaism and the Egyptians would take it one further. There was a great pharaoh in Egypt about 1400 BC called Akhenaten. And Akhenaten attempted to reduce the pantheon down to 1. He believed in the worship of a single god. And because of this, he was actually murdered by the priests of all the other religions. But he was the first to attempt to shrink it down to the number 1. Judaism, after they came back from the land of Babylon in 529 BC, made the next attempt. And that's the first time that you find monotheism within Judaism. Moses, for instance, was not a monotheist. Moses, who flourished about 1250 BC, he believed in what was called monolatry, but not monotheism. Monolatry is the worship of a single divinity among many, but not the belief that there is only one, but rather, okay, there's many gods out there, and we're choosing Yahweh, he's our guy. That's monolatry, but it's not monotheism. Moses was not a monotheist. Monotheism would not come into Judaism until about the year 500 BC. So now you're shrinking God down, and the number one becomes really, really important when attached to God. But you're going to get very, very many versions of this notion of one God. In some texts, this one God is a distant, demanding deity, a really punitive, jealous God who punishes viciously for any infractions of his law. Jesus comes and he talks about a very, very different one God. He talks about Abba, daddy, a daddy figure. And in my understanding, I would say even further that there is only one, there is only God. I keep saying to you that life itself is a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that source is having. So ultimately, there's just a nested series of dreams. And everything that exists is simply God in drag. There is nothing except God. And so it all boils down to just this oneness, this monad. But there's a notion even beyond that. And it's the notion of attributing zero to God. So not only, one notion is God is infinite, infinity. Another is that he's just one. Another notion is that he does not exist. Not in the sense in which there is no God, but in the sense that we can say nothing about it. And so, as I was saying, Buddhism says emptiness is form, and form is emptiness. Out of the nothingness of the fertile womb of source comes all that possibly can manifest. So emptiness is form. At the core of every form is the emptiness out of which it manifested, and all form goes back into this emptiness. And Buddhism will further say, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. In other words, if you think you've understood God and you've tried to capture God in a series of propositions, kill it before it kills you. And Meister Eckhart, the great Christian mystic of the 1400s, would say, I pray daily to God to rid me of God. In other words, the gods we have constructed in our theological systems, they are not God. You know, God exists, I'm convinced, and we experience God, but we cannot articulate that experience. The experience itself is utterly and radically ineffable. It cannot be put into words. Words are very leaky vessels, but we can have the experiences. So Eckhart is saying, any theologies we construct, they're just temporary maps of the terrain. The terrain, the map is never the actual terrain itself. So you have to go back to the notion that the God that we believe in does not exist. And there's a whole language in mystical theology for this. It's called the apophatic language, where you make a proposition X, God is not X. Y, God is not Y. Z, God is not Z. And so by kind of indirection, find direction out. You back yourself into the experience of God by not trying to put into words who God might be. And this is the whole essence of Zen Buddhism, the whole notion of the koan, proposing statements that cannot be intellectually resolved, like what is the sound of one hand clapping? Or what did your original face look like before your grandparents were born? There's no intellectual way of unpacking those statements, because Zen Buddhism is trying to back you into the experience of God, but the realization that your intellect is not going to be able to take you there. It can take you to the threshold, but not all the way. So then the notion that God is the nothingness, that's the third number which is ascribed to God. And in many, many traditions, again, you have this notion. I shared with you a story from the Talmud a few weeks ago, a great Jewish compendium of stories, reflections on the scriptures, about 4 rabbis who independently all begged God that they might have, a glance of them, that they could enter heaven just temporarily to have an experience of the divine. And God finally granted it. And the first guy goes in, and because of the experience he has, he dies of fright. And the second guy goes in, and because of the experience he has, he loses his mind and goes totally crazy. He can't handle it. And the third guy goes in, and because of the experience, he loses his faith and becomes an apostate. He no longer believes. And the fourth guy goes in, he's called Rabbi Akiba. And only Rabbi Akiba was able to go in, encounter the divine, and come back out, because only Rabbi Akiba realized that even the absence of God is God. So the bottom line is, you can count on God.